Blade Runner is perhaps the pinnacle of science fiction media. The incredible world building, the stunning cinematography, the thought-provoking themes, and the iconic score all come together to create a truly unforgettable experience. It was only right that after 15 years, another classic would emerge, this time in the realm of video games. Development for Blade Runner's game did not start off well. Rights to the film were spread amongst numerous entities, which made making a game really complicated from a copyright perspective. Developer Westwood Studios' solution to such legal constraints was to create a game within the environment of the film, not to use any footage or audio from the film. Although these elements were off limits for Westwood, they were allowed to capture the likeness of the actors who appeared in the film. Sean Young, James Hong, William Sanderson, and Joe Turkel reprised their roles in the game, but Harrison Ford, who played protagonist Rick Deckard, never responded to Westwood, although they never had plans of casting him as a major character. Ford didn't enjoy production of the film as he had frequent disputes with director Ridley Scott. Likewise, Scott had a sour experience and was not involved in the production of the game. Visionary concept artist and illustrator Sid Mead did come back, however. His artwork was used to shape the aesthetic of the Blade Runner universe, alongside films like Tron and Alien. The game's art director instructed his design team to follow a similar approach, where no elements in the game were to be original creations and everything was to be based on either the film or Sid's art. The story runs parallel to the events of the film, with rookie officer Ray McCoy working on his own replicant case. It was very important to the developers that the game stay in its own lane and not interfere with any story events from the film. Although many characters and events subtly overlap, the two stories work well building off of each other. The game's story progresses through McCoy's investigation of various cases, each of which leads to a discovery of a new clue or suspect. The typical detective game. I truly felt like a detective, getting to collect and assess clues, use the Voight-Kampff test, sift through the Esper computer, and navigate the world of a dystopic Los Angeles. Common for its time, Blade Runner doesn't hold your hand through its puzzles. It doesn't say what you need to find or when you found it, further immersing the player into the world. And you can also find many different ways to track down a lead, which leads me to perhaps the most interesting aspect about the game's story, its structure. Your actions had consequences, leading up to 13 different game endings. Some characters in the game had a chance of either being a replicant or a human, and it changed with each new game that you played. So every time you play the game, there will be something or someone that's different, leading to an incredible amount of replayability. I've played the game 3 times and I've discovered different replicants, clues, and endings in each one. Again, this was revolutionary for its time. Additionally, the game makes many allusions to Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, the book that inspired the Blade Runner film. I love the subtle references to book elements like kibble, specials, and the significance of real animals. The game, similar to Androids, weighs whether or not McCoy is a human or a replicant. As is the case, it's up for you to decide. Blade Runner is a visually stunning game, especially when you consider when it was created. It's a perfect representation of a cyberpunk future that accurately captures the film's iconic noir-inspired aesthetic. As I mentioned, you visit many of the locations from the film, sometimes perfectly matching shots. The game's environments are highly detailed, with a strong emphasis on neon lighting and rain-soaked streets, creating a believable and immersive world. I mean, just look at this. The game features voxel-based graphics, which were a relatively new technology at the time. Voxels are a type of 3D pixel similar to pixels in 2D images that are used to create 3D models and environments. This technology allowed for such complex and detailed environments to be created. But there was a distinct challenge in mimicking the atmosphere and complexity of the Blade Runner film. It was difficult to layer and compress characters, movement, volumetrics, and lighting on a lower-end computer in 1997. In order for the game to sell well, it also had to run on the lowest computing denominators. In a time where most games looked like this, Westwood Studios overcame these graphical challenges and created a game playable for all while maintaining the game's atmosphere that was so important to the franchise's setting. Speaking of atmosphere, the game wouldn't be complete without the film's iconic soundtrack and sound effects. The game features highly immersive audio design, which complements the original film. Now, as I mentioned, the game wasn't allowed to use the film's soundtrack verbatim, but they were allowed to replicate it. The game's composer, Frank Klepacki, recreated Vangelis' original score by ear and recreated an immersive, oppressive soundscape of both tension and intrigue. The game's use of ambient sound effects, such as the humming of machines, chatter of crowds in a market, or very familiar carnival music, also effectively capture the film's noir-inspired aesthetic and add to the game's overall atmosphere. On release, Blade Runner was well received by critics, with much acclaim for its innovative graphics, immersive atmosphere, and adherence to the source material, which was unusual for a game back then, and it still is. Overall, the game was considered a triumph in staying true to the original while expanding upon it in a meaningful way. While many loved the game, some did not. A common complaint about the game was its ambiguity and rather loose ending. Additionally, for an action and adventure title, action was used sparingly, leading to a much slower pace than gamers were used to at the time. Nearly a decade after its release, Blade Runner sold 1 million copies. With time, like the movie, it became a cult classic. As such, gamers wanted to continue playing the game as technology evolved. However, the game's source code and assets were lost as Westwood Studios moved, so the possibility of a remaster for modern devices was impossible. It seemed that Blade Runner was lost for good. However, after 8 years of intensive work, ScumVM announced full support for Blade Runner on digital platforms including Windows, Linux, and Mac. After some time, Blade Runner made its way to platforms like GOG and Steam for the world to enjoy. If you're a fan of Blade Runner, cyberpunk, or even science fiction for that matter, I really encourage you to pick this game up, try it, and let me know what you think. The universe of Blade Runner lives on long after the credits roll.